At first light over the South China Sea, China unleashed a sudden barrage of 12 ballistic missiles aimed squarely at a U.S. aircraft carrier group lawfully navigating international waters. This wasn't an exercise. It was a simulation, one that mirrors a very real and imminent threat. No alert, no announcement, just a swarm of hypersonic warheads slicing through the sky at speeds never before encountered by any active defense system. Within moments, the United States Navy's technological edge was pushed to its limits. The scenario raised urgent, sobering questions for military leadership. Could America still dominate the seas if blindsided by hypersonic firepower? And if China were to launch a surprise strike, could U.S. forces survive even the opening 10 minutes? Let's unpack this step by step with Red Zone secrets. The war begins in eerie quiet, then erupts into a flash of velocity. Deep within Chinese territory, a dozen DF-26B ballistic missiles arc skyward, locked on to a U.S. carrier strike group sailing through the Philippine Sea. No negotiations. No buildup. Just a devastating opening gambit, precisely timed to disorient and overwhelm. These aren't conventional weapons. Known as carrier killers, the DF-26Bs are China's premier long-range anti-ship missiles. Traveling at hypersonic speeds, faster than Mach 10, they're capable of covering vast distances to strike moving naval targets with deadly precision. What makes them especially terrifying is their maneuverability. These warheads can evade missile defenses mid-flight, adjusting course and delivering high-powered anti-ship payloads with unnerving accuracy. It's not just a threat, it's a declaration. That declaration is unmistakable. China no longer intends to fight long, grinding wars. Its strategy now is to cripple U.S. sea power before a counterstrike is even possible. The USS Ronald Reagan, a nuclear-powered carrier, and a linchpin of America's presence in the Pacific, becomes the focal point of the assault. USS Ronald Reagan. Even a single successful strike on a carrier would deliver a severe blow to the Navy's credibility, and to Washington's ability to reassure allies in the region. The missile barrage reveals a new doctrine. Leverage speed and shock to cripple the enemy before the first full battle unfolds. This is asymmetric warfare in action, not matching U.S. forces ship for ship, but eliminating their greatest asset from hundreds of miles away. And with only minutes between ignition and detonation, the response window is razor-thin. The strike is as much mental as it is material. A hit doesn't just damage steel, it destabilizes alliances. It would rattle confidence in partners like Japan and the Philippines, underscoring that Beijing is willing to act swiftly and decisively while Washington weighs its options. That perception alone could shift diplomatic tides and shake America's role as Pacific guarantor. Though this remains a scenario for now, the threat it illustrates is anything but imaginary. Hypersonic weapons like the DF-26B are already deployed and operational, and America's adversaries are watching closely to see how Washington might react. Because next time, the launch might not be part of a simulation. But the most jarring moment came just 2 minutes later, when American defenses were stretched to the breaking point by the hypersonic barrage. At precisely 5:02 a.m., alarm shrieked across the strike group. U.S. radar systems had detected a dozen incoming DF-26B missiles, each one locked on key U.S. warships. Within moments, the Aegis combat system snapped into action. Nearby destroyers launched SM-3 interceptors in rapid succession. 4 targets were destroyed before impact, but the remaining 8 surged forward, unfazed and lethal. That moment exposed a sobering reality. America's protective umbrella isn't impenetrable. Aegis, once hailed as the ultimate naval shield, failed to stop the majority of incoming threats. And it wasn't due to a lack of readiness or human error. The simple fact was this: the missiles were too fast. At speeds exceeding Mach 10, the DF-26Bs closed the gap faster than the Aegis system could recalculate firing solutions. In an actual conflict, this kind of delay wouldn't just result in damage. It could cost lives, sink ships, and tip the regional balance of power. The US Navy did everything by the book. But this time, even its most advanced system wasn't enough. The problem isn't with training, it's with design. The Aegis system was born in the Cold War and perfected over decades to counter traditional ballistic threats that follow predictable arcs. But these modern hypersonic missiles break all the rules. They twist, dive, and shift mid-flight. Their speed is rivaled only by their intelligence. By combining breakneck velocity with erratic maneuvering, they slip past radar locks and confuse interception algorithms. To counter them, US interceptors must predict their trajectory. But at Mach 10, even a 1-second delay is fatal. In this simulation, only 4 of the 12 missiles were stopped. And that outcome wasn't random. It revealed a deeper vulnerability, a defense system overwhelmed by sheer volume and outmatched by sheer speed. This wasn't just a weapons test, it was a demonstration of a strategy. China didn't stagger the launches. It fired all 12 nearly simultaneously, forcing American systems to split attention and resources across multiple incoming threats. Military analysts call this tactic saturation. The objective isn't precision, it's overload. The more simultaneous targets, the less likely all can be stopped. By pairing volume with velocity, China ensured that even if some were destroyed, others would inevitably get through. And in this simulated engagement, 8 did. The DF-26B wasn't chosen at random. It was selected for its blend of speed, precision, and mobility. Fired from deep within Chinese territory, it can endanger American warships without ever exposing Chinese personnel to direct retaliation. This strategy signals a dramatic evolution in modern warfare. Rather than engaging the US Navy ship for ship, China is targeting a key weakness: America's limited reaction window. It's the dangerous result of insufficient deterrence. When your enemies believe you're unprepared, they don't hesitate. They strike first, strike hard, and aim to leave no room for retaliation. The failure highlighted by this scenario isn't just a technical one, it's also deeply political. Many analysts argue that America fell behind in hypersonic defense due to lapses in leadership. Under President Trump, defense budgets shifted away from emerging technologies and prioritized older systems, investing heavily in tanks and border barriers rather than cutting-edge missile defense. Meanwhile, China funneled billions into developing next-generation strike capabilities. Asian allies had been raising the alarm for years. Nations like Japan, South Korea, and Australia warned Washington about the expanding scope of China's missile arsenal. But amid mixed messages and a more isolationist stance from US leadership, urgent action was delayed. The result? A widening gap in defense readiness, one that now threatens to become a global liability. Once seen as the centerpiece of American maritime dominance, the Aegis system suddenly looks fallible. And if US warships can't protect themselves, how can they guarantee protection for allies like Taiwan, the Philippines, or Japan? China won't interpret that vulnerability as a reason to pull back. It will treat it as an opening and push even harder. And then, just 3 minutes later, one hypersonic strike drove home exactly why the DF-26B has earned the nickname Carrier Killer. At 5:05 a.m., a catastrophic scene unfolded aboard the USS Theodore Roosevelt. 2 DF-26B missiles traveling at speeds over Mach 10 evaded all defensive measures and slammed into the heart of one of America's most formidable aircraft carriers. The first warhead hit near the forward fuel depot, triggering a violent explosion. The second detonated in the aircraft maintenance zone, hurling debris across the flight deck like shrapnel from a battlefield. In a matter of seconds, 4 F/A-18 Super Hornets were annihilated, their fuel cells erupting in secondary explosions. The blasts ripped open sections of the reinforced deck, disabled both catapult launch systems, and immediately activated the carrier's internal fire suppression protocols. Flying metal fragments tore through communications arrays, severing key antenna lines and disrupting vital systems. The Roosevelt's nerve center was plunged into chaos, blacked out by smoke, with alarms screaming and compartment lights flickering. The carrier wasn't just hit, it was incapacitated. This marked the first time in modern history that a U.S. aircraft carrier suffered a direct missile strike in combat conditions. And it didn't just destroy hardware. It obliterated a long-standing belief that American carriers were invincible symbols of power. The enemy had landed a brutal opening blow. As fires raged across the deck, the crew leapt into crisis mode. But nothing about what followed was standard procedure. The fuel-fed flames raced across the deck faster than simulations had predicted, inching dangerously close to the munitions bay. Below, emergency response teams sealed off multiple sections, including one where 3 sailors were still trapped behind a jammed bulkhead. Overhead, thick plumes of smoke reduced visibility to just a few feet. Radios either sputtered static or went dead entirely. For 6 agonizing minutes, the USS Roosevelt was effectively cut off. No communication, no coordination, no certainty. It was isolated in the middle of a crisis. With each moment that passed, the threat of a secondary explosion loomed larger. Commanders faced impossible decisions: preserve critical systems or protect the lives of their crew. Entire compartments were sealed off or evacuated to stop the fire from spreading. Others were saturated in fire-retardant foam, snuffing out flames, but also disabling important onboard systems in the process. This wasn't a simulation. It wasn't a drill. It was a real-time trial by fire, one that tested not just technology, but human grit in the face of chaos. And during those first crucial minutes, the deadliest threat wasn't the missile anymore. It was fear, disorientation, and the countdown echoing inside the steel corridors. The psychological blow hit just as hard as the physical one. For decades, American aircraft carriers had stood as floating symbols of global command, arriving silently and reshaping entire diplomatic conversations without needing to fire a shot. But now, with flames licking at the flight deck and wreckage all around, the Roosevelt no longer embodied dominance. It looked exposed, and that realization hit fast and deep. Morale faltered. Sailors questioned whether the ship's defenses were as strong as they'd believed. Officers struggled to reassert control over a vessel built to lead entire fleets into battle. Even support ships nearby hesitated, scanning the sky in dread, unsure whether more warheads were moments away. The sense of vulnerability wasn't confined to one ship. It spread outward across the entire Pacific theater. Allies like Japan, South Korea, and Australia watched the unfolding crisis with growing unease. If the U.S. Navy couldn't shield its own carriers, how could it be relied on to defend theirs? The Roosevelt hadn't sunk, but a single, precision missile strike had cracked the illusion of invulnerability. That one blow forced an immediate reassessment of everything, from naval strategy to international security doctrine. And while the damage on the deck was severe, the deeper failure lay further inland, back in Washington. Defense analysts had sounded the alarm about hypersonic threats like the DF-26B for years. They warned that these weapons could slip past conventional missile shields. But the response came too slow. Aegis-class destroyers, once thought to be the apex of sea-based defense, proved unable to catch every projectile. Carrier strike groups had not been equipped with layered protection built for the speed, agility, and chaos that hypersonics now represented. The U.S. Navy had trained extensively for cyber intrusions, swarming drones, submarine ambushes. But it had yet to fully reckon with the reality of modern missile warfare, a threat that can dismantle decades of planning in less than 10 minutes. And so, as smoke cleared and the Roosevelt's crew scrambled to restore order, a more ominous signal was already on its way. At exactly 5:10 a.m., barely 5 minutes after the initial strike, a second wave launched into motion. It came faster, flying lower, and with far less predictability. A new nightmare was beginning. From a distance safely beyond the reach of American interceptors, a squadron of Chinese H-6K bombers launched a barrage of 16 YJ-12 cruise missiles. These weren't the high-arc behemoths of ballistic warfare. These were sea-skimming predators, streaking just a few meters above the ocean surface, slipping beneath radar horizons and vanishing into the chaotic noise of sea clutter. The YJ-12 surged forward at nearly Mach 3. But speed wasn't their only weapon. They were unpredictable. Each missile darted and juked through the air in jagged, zigzagging paths, evading clean tracking and frustrating any attempt to calculate a precise intercept course. That evasiveness was no accident. It was deliberate, engineered to overload the Aegis system's processors and exploit any momentary lapse in tracking. The system's reaction time shrank to milliseconds, and those milliseconds weren't enough. By the time the countermeasures responded, the missiles had already entered the kill zone. This wasn't just a follow-up strike, it was the second hit in a tightly choreographed combination. China's intentions were clear. Don't just hit hard, strike again before your opponent catches their breath. Tempo became its own form of aggression. Accuracy turned into a weaponized strategy. Aboard the Roosevelt, the situation turned critical. The air was thick with smoke. Fire still clawed at the battered flight deck. Several F/A-18 Hornets, already ravaged by the earlier impact, now lay in burning heaps, blocking the vital catapult lanes needed for any kind of airborne response. Damage control teams worked frantically, cutting through twisted fuselages, sealing ruptured fuel lines, and battling persistent flare-ups across multiple decks. Power surged and died in sporadic pulses as engineers rerouted energy pathways and fought to keep command systems online. Then, a new sound filled the air, a deafening mechanical howl. The YJ-12s had arrived. The Roosevelt's phalanx CIWS turrets spun to life, spraying incandescent tungsten rounds at the oncoming swarm. RIM-7 Sea Sparrow missiles roared skyward, seeking fast-moving targets across the horizon. But 16 highly agile cruise missiles were more than any single ship could handle alone. The surrounding Arleigh Burke-class destroyers in the carrier's protective ring fired off SM-2 interceptors in quick succession, while clouds of metallic chaff burst from launchers, hoping to confuse guidance systems. Still, the sheer volume of missiles and the blistering pace of their approach began to expose fractures in the fleet's defensive layers. Worse yet, signs emerged that this wasn't just a physical onslaught. Communication stuttered, response times lagged, and radar feeds flickered. Sophisticated jamming was in play. The attack was multi-layered. A kinetic strike married with cyber and electronic warfare. The carrier strike group wasn't just being bombarded, it was being unstitched. This was the shape of modern Chinese military doctrine: saturate, scramble, and control the tempo of conflict. And by this point, one truth became clear. The Roosevelt's battle group wasn't dictating the engagement anymore. The initiative had slipped through their fingers. It was responding. But in combat, reaction is a position of weakness. With radar arrays overloaded and fire teams stretched thin, the formation had no breathing room to mount a coordinated response. More than anything else, this assault revealed a sobering reality. America's dependence on aging doctrines and Cold War-era technology had become a strategic liability. During prior years, critical investments in advanced missile defense and cutting-edge electronic warfare systems had been deprioritized. The Trump-era pivot toward legacy platforms, tanks, walls, and traditional firepower had left a technological vacuum right where innovation was needed most. And now, that oversight was measured not in dollars, but in seconds, in survivability. For 5 harrowing minutes, the most dominant navy in the world appeared stunned, staggered on the ropes. China hadn't needed to sink the Roosevelt. Paralyzing her was enough. And with that, Beijing proved a chilling concept. Overwhelming power no longer demands proximity. Dominance could now be projected from hundreds of miles out, delivered with speed and precision alone. By 5:15 a.m., the USS Roosevelt was in critical condition. Fire still raged across the deck. Comms were patchy at best, and key aircraft were already lost. More YJ-12 missiles were rapidly closing in, the last streaks of a brutal assault wave. Defensive munitions had been heavily depleted. Damage control crews were running on fumes. the situation was quickly veering toward irrecoverable, until help arrived from the western horizon. At precisely 6 a.m., the USS Nimitz strike group emerged on radar. Within moments, Stingray MQ-25 drones launched into the sky, acting as lifelines. These unmanned refueling aircraft gave what remained of the Roosevelt's air wing the time and range they desperately needed, extending flight duration, enabling greater patrol coverage, and allowing a renewed defensive posture to take shape. But fuel wasn't the only reinforcement the Nimitz delivered. Flanking the carrier, its escort ships, Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, and Ticonderoga-class cruisers, immediately took up firing positions. SM-2 interceptors hissed from vertical launch cells. 127mm naval guns locked onto incoming trajectories. A new defensive ring emerged, tougher, more coordinated, and determined to hold the line. The counterpunch had begun, and none too soon. But the Nimitz group didn't just retaliate with firepower, it struck back with doctrine. Rear Admiral Peterson initiated Distributed Maritime Operations, DMO, a forward-thinking battle plan designed for exactly this kind of scenario. Rather than concentrating assets into a vulnerable cluster, DMO dispersed them across a wide tactical grid. No single missile could cripple multiple vessels. Each ship became a sensor and weapons platform in its own right, extending the fleet's reach while tightening its resilience. Immediately, the dynamics changed. Escort ships held staggered intervals, sweeping wide arcs with overlapping radar coverage, forming a resilient shield around the crippled Roosevelt. And for the first time that morning, momentum began to shift. As Chinese missiles entered strike range, U.S. warships unleashed synchronized salvos, leveraging overlapping firing arcs to maximize their chances of interception. Overhead, UVs launched from both the Nimitz and the damaged Roosevelt streamed live targeting data back to the task force, dramatically improving precision and reaction speed. Within minutes, the final YJ-12s were taken down, some just miles from their intended marks. Victory wasn't won by sheer firepower. It was coordination under pressure, agile command, and cutting-edge data integration that turned the tide. DMO, once a forward-looking concept, had just saved an American carrier group in real time. The Roosevelt survived, but only just. 4 aircraft were lost, several crew members were injured, and its flight deck was scorched and barely operational. Still, the carrier floated, and so did hope. In military terms, enduring an attack of that scale means more than brute resilience. It reflects adaptability, a unified response, and leadership under crisis. But beneath the tactical victory lay a deeper warning. China's missile doctrine isn't theoretical anymore, it's active. The U.S. Navy, even under overwhelming pressure, showed it can still hit back. The Nimitz group's actions proved that with the right strategy, rapid deployment of UAVs, and utilization of modern systems like the SM-2, U.S. forces could rally and resist. But critics had long warned of a looming gap. Years of underinvestment in next-gen naval warfare left the fleet exposed. The near catastrophe validated those fears. The Roosevelt survived, but what if it hadn't? Let's consider the full-scale consequences of this fictional scenario turning real. If a U.S. aircraft carrier had suffered a direct missile strike, the world would be thrown into chaos. A successful hit on an American supercarrier is more than a tactical disaster. It's a geopolitical shockwave. The fallout would ripple through military alliances, financial markets, and global diplomacy. And stopping that momentum once it starts? Almost impossible. Human casualties would come first, potentially hundreds of American sailors killed or wounded. The carrier systems would be crippled. Fires and secondary explosions might make the ship unrecoverable. At that point, retaliation would be almost certain. U.S. cruise missile strikes would likely target Chinese radar arrays, missile platforms, and command infrastructure. From there, escalation would be nearly unavoidable. The U.S. could raise military readiness to DEFCON 2, the last step before full nuclear mobilization. Not since the Cuban Missile Crisis has America come so close. DEFCON 2 means bombers are on standby, nuclear silos are primed, and strike authority is nearly autonomous. Even if nuclear weapons remain unused, the mere shift toward DEFCON would send shockwaves. Financial markets would spiral. Oil prices could double as trade routes through the South China Sea collapse. Global stock markets, from New York to Tokyo, would crash in response. Most critically, the very notion of U.S. deterrence would fracture. American military presence has long been a stabilizing force. But if a carrier can be hit, if a fleet can be paralyzed, what else can be? That single doubt could embolden adversaries worldwide. Rogue regimes and militant groups might view the U.S. as slow, indecisive, or distracted, ripe for provocation. This is the dark path of strategic miscalculation, one where power balances collapse, alliances wobble, and wars begin not with declarations, but with silence, followed by fire. Right now, China is investing heavily in A2/AD strategies, hypersonics, and electronic warfare, all designed to push American forces out of Asia. Meanwhile, America bets on drone warfare, distributed fleets, and real-time adaptability. But this silent arms race is accelerating, and the line between peace and conflict is fading fast. What once felt like tomorrow's challenge is now today's reality. The Thucydides trap, the idea that rising powers inevitably confront established ones, is no longer theoretical. It's unfolding now, day by day, mile by mile. So the only question left is this: will we recognize the threat before it's too late? Or will the next war begin with a strike no one dares to answer? That's what Red Zone Secrets set out to reveal today, offering you sharp, honest reporting grounded in expert insight and military realism. If you found value in this breakdown, please like and subscribe. Your support fuels our mission to bring you serious, thoughtful coverage of global defense trends. Share your perspective in the comments, and we'll see you in the next video. Stay safe. Until next time.